Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. This is the fifth in this series on limited palette portrait painting. Last week we kind of carried on refining the larger forms or the kind of medium-sized forms in the face from our initial stages, which was sort of blocking in. So you can see everything's kind of starting to come together with it, but there's still a lot of refinement necessary. Today we're going to be carrying on just in the face, mostly with the skin and the eyes, nose and lips. We're not actually going to be working on the beard and rest of the background today. We're going to do that next week, so that'll be our final step. From this point onwards, so the point that we've arrived at up until today, you could sort of do anything you like. So if you felt like doing the background before refining the face, you'd be totally welcome to. At this point it's just a case of finishing as you want to finish around the piece. So I'm going to leave the background and beard and hair for today, and we're going to do that next week, which will be our kind of a final session on this piece. We're just going to be focusing on adding a little bit more refinement to the, probably mostly to the eyes, a little bit to the nose and a bit to the mouth. Possibly adding a little bit more turning generally across the face, although I'm reasonably happy with how it looks at the moment. So as with previous sessions, we're sticking with this limited palette, which means using titanium white, which I think I've got some on my palette already, yellow ochre, cadmium red, and ivory black. So I'm just going to put a little bit extra of each of those out. At this stage you're not going to be using quite as much paint as you have been, just because we're doing kind of finer glazes. We're just going to be using small brushes, so I'll go through which brushes we're using in a moment. So I squeeze out this paint. So I've got my paint sorted. The other thing I was going to talk about today quickly is a concept which comes up, well hopefully I think has come up before, but it's called fat over lean. So as you're doing a layered painting like this, got some oil here, you want to have a larger proportion of oil in subsequent layers. So if you remember, the first layers were just mineral spirits, and then we slowly started to mix more and more oil in as we went. So by now we're up to kind of like a half oil, half mineral spirit mixture. The reason that's important is as the paint layers dry over the top of one another, each week that we've worked on this has been a new layer, and then we've been working over a dry layer below. Layers with a lower oil content or a lower ratio of oil to mineral spirits will dry faster than layers with a lot of oil, because oil takes longer to dry than mineral spirits. And what that means is if you put a layer that's just mineral spirits over a layer that's just oil, that mineral spirits layer will get harder a lot faster than the oil layer, which means that as the oil layer continues to dry and change shape slightly over sort of 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it'll crack the layer above. So it's not something you'll see immediately, but it is something that affects the longevity of the piece. And it's always good, regardless of what stage you're at in terms of your skill with art or your kind of confidence in your art. It's always good to kind of maintain proper practices with your work and expect that the work should last for that long. Just finding a brush. I'm going to oil in today, so last week we didn't actually oil in. If you remember, oiling in is just putting a thin layer of oil over the painting, just to resaturate everything. So you see that as I do that, these darker colours, so darker colours tend to do something called sinking in, which means that they become lighter and less saturated than they will be when they're ultimately varnished. So with oil paintings, we always varnish them. And spreading a layer of the medium so I've already mixed up the medium we're going to use today. Spreading a layer of that over the top of the painting will just resaturate everything for us. There we go, you can see it's kind of resaturated everything a bit. Just wipe some of that excess oil off. You don't want to overload the painting with oil because it'll mean that subsequent layers won't stick, and when you ultimately varnish it, the varnishing layer might not work. So don't overdo that stage, but what we did there is sufficient. So, as I say, today I want to go in and just focus on some of these forms in the eyes and the nose. And I might work a little bit just reinforcing possibly some of these lighter colours in the forehead. You might do that. Start with that now. So you can see it's just starting to add a little bit more complexity to the form in this forehead, which is what I'm after. So again, it's like a sort of scumbly glaze type thing like we were talking about last week. Just making minor adjustments. Trying to develop the form in kind of exactly the way that we want it. So looking for subtle shifts between warm and cool as well. So we can also work on some of these more subtle transitions out of the eyebrow. Kind of soften those forms slightly. It's all a bit of a crease and just above the eyebrow there as well, so you can develop that. So I don't have to stay too tied to any particular area. This week I'm just kind of working around adding detail where I feel it's necessary. Just slowly building this this piece up. I'm going to try to get a little bit more form into this nose. It's slightly flat at the moment. That means thinking about how it projects out of the rest of the face. You spot anywhere that you think you've made a good mixture. So I thought maybe that mixture I had would work for the eye, though I think it's slightly too bright, this mixture. Gonna make up something a little bit darker. That's better. And once again going back in and reinforcing these pretty deep occlusion shadows, which you should know if you've had a look through the shadow lessons, where the skin sort of tucks back in around the eye, so there's very little light reaching it, which means it ends up very dark. The other thing that we want to give a suggestion of in the eyes is the eyelashes. It's using quite a thin brush. I can give a suggestion of those. And then we also want to start to turn the top of this occlusion shadow up into the the brow, because there's essentially a transition that comes up, kind of wraps up out of it. So you can see we're getting slightly kind of softer transition out of that eye now, which is nice. There are some slightly bright colours as well, so I'm starting to look for some of those, some kind of to do with the reflected light. If we leave those out, it'll end up looking a little bit dead, so I want to make sure we keep that chroma in the shadows. Do some of it down here at the bottom of the nose as well. Just gone a little bit grey. And under here, some of these reflected lights. So you want to kind of always scan around the image as you're working in these stages. Just going around and correcting what needs to be corrected, what feels like is missing from our painting. That's our primary concern at this stage. I'm not too unhappy with how the eyes developed. So you see at this stage it's not a case of really adding anything to the piece, it's just refining what's there already. That's what we're after. So it's generally a fun stage, I would say. Less high, well, not high pressure, but because everything's already there and you're just kind of making adjustments, you don't need to take any kind of complex decisions, make any complex decisions at this stage. Which is nice. You can just sort of enjoy the piece, developing the piece. So I'm thinking about the form of the eyeballs now. They're going to be a little lighter on the right hand side compared to the left. So I'm trying to make sure that's the case. That's because the light source is coming from the left hand side, so they're going to turn a bit. Yeah, it's not too bad how it is. Probably the same goes for the irises. That's quite nice. Starts to kind of brighten up the eyes, give them a bit more character, which is good. So I'm pretty happy with how these eyes are turning out. Just going to add a little bit more around them. That's not too bad. Add some of these darker tones on this side as well. So I feel like there's not quite enough turning going on from the forms aren't turning enough out of this right hand side of the face. It's got a chance to kind of correct that a bit. Happy with how these lighter forms look, but not so much these darkest halftones that should be turning out of the shadows. Go back down to this nose again. So just doing the same thing that we're doing with the eyes, but just increasing the complexity of these transitions. So adding smaller kind of intermediary values and colours where necessary. Just kind of lightly working over what's below. So now that we've added that light to the left hand side of the face, it's sort of brought everything together a bit, so we can keep pushing that a bit more. Even in this brow here. It's quite a level light, so it means it's kind of coming in straight from that left hand side. Starting to work quite well. Really does make a bit more sense of the lighting. So adding that those darker values on this side, adding lighter values on the left hand side is just creating more general form across the whole piece, which is what we're after at this stage. Possibly could have reconciled this in the previous lesson actually, but you find that kind of working in these layered sessions allows you to kind of work through things at a slow pace, think about them. You know, last week we kind of altered the colours but didn't necessarily develop the forms quite as much as we've been able to this week, which is the point of this layered approach. So you can think about the forms and kind of build them up progressively. Yeah, so I'm reasonably reasonably happy again with how that's worked out. So the only thing left to do is maybe just reinforce these highlights in the eye again, as the eye's very glossy, so it's always should always be the most intense highlight in the painting. Might just slightly reinforce kind of glistening quality at the bottom eyelid as well. Tends to give a little bit more character to faces, and maybe just a dash, a little bit more kind of brightness there on the lip. And finally, last thing I'll do is just a slightly brighter, try to build up the light in the tip of this nose. Something like that's not too bad, maybe just up there as well. That's not too bad. So you see, it's just added a little bit more sort of sophistication to the face, and that's probably about the point that we'll leave it. And so next week, as I say, we'll be getting to work on the hair and the background, so that'll add a little bit more detail to it. Just tilt up a bit here so you can get a good view face. But yeah, that's pretty much it, so you can kind of get a feel for it. It's all progressive, it's gradual, this sort of painting. It's not getting everything done immediately. You can correct things, you can adjust colours, you can adjust values and chroma, you can adjust shapes, but mostly everything that we wanted was established by this point in the painting. So you can see they're kind of minor adjustments, but they add a lot to the piece, which is what we're after as we're kind of progressively adding detail. So yeah, that's it for this week. Hopefully it was an interesting lesson. As always, subscribe to the channel if you want to keep up to date with videos, and visit the OCAD Studio page if you want to sign up to get one-on-one tutorials with me of any of the work that you do from these classes. But yeah, that's it. I'll see you guys next week for the final lesson, where we'll be finishing this piece off.